Stop whatever you're doing and give this a watch because, trust me, you are going to love it.
I need everything to know me like some benzos, a wedding ring. Find me anything to kill some time, a soliloquy, a lullaby. We were so close.
Today on Meet the Poet, we are joined by Otis Mensah, who is a hip-hop and spoken word artist and the former Poet Laureate of Sheffield. Now, his poetry is all about breaking boundaries and it's beautifully truthful. I was just completely entranced listening to him read his work during our recording, so I'm sure you will be too. Give this a watch and drop us a like, a comment, subscribe to our channels and follow us on socials. But most importantly, go and show Otis's work some love because it deserves it. Now, I really hope you enjoy. In fact, I know that you will. Otis, welcome to Meet the Poet. Thank you so much for joining me here today. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm good, yeah. Excited to be up in the morning with some poetry by my side and a coffee. So
Good, glad
yeah,
to hear
all good.
it. Glad to hear it. So, let's start off with you're a hip hop and spoken word artist. Can you tell us a bit about how you fuse those together and why you fuse those together, actually?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question, such a sort of like wide question. I think for me it sort of like personally began with my artistic journeying as a teenager, looking for somewhat of an outlet expressionistically and looking to sort of try and find a voice in the arts that I felt represented by. And that wasn't always the poets on my syllabus. That wasn't always the poets that I might have had access to in, like textbooks or, whatever the traditional canon was. So, I mean, that sort of triggered me to search further. And for me, I ended up finding hip hop culture. And hip hop culture sort of gave a foundation for poetic vulnerability. It gave a foundation for radical honesty. And I think this is where I started to realize that this could be for me personally, this could be sort of like a canvas for poetic expression and for me to start to understand myself a little more. And poetry just happened to be the art form and the vehicle that was sort of soliciting that. So yeah, I have a very vivid memory of listening to an album by The Roots, which are a hip hop collective, a hip hop group from Philadelphia, an album called Things Fall Apart. And there is a song that features a poet called Ursula Rucker. And I mean, this really changed my life. This piece sort of like shook me and made me realize that poetry didn't have to be this thing that was I don't know, beautified or fabricated. It could be something that is raw. It could be something that that was truly vulnerable. And of course, listening to this, engaging with this, I realized that poetry wasn't as whitewashed as I was once told. It's like I could be represented by poetic voices, and I could participate in that myself. And yeah, that sort of changed my perspective, and I started to see the two as sort of one entity, and engaging with each other.
I mean, you're so right. There's a very particular type of poetry that you get taught in school. I mean, what do you think that your school experience would have been like if you'd been shown the sort of stuff that you went out looking for and the sort of stuff that you actually make now? I mean, and because you've also done some work with school kids in the past, like, yeah, I mean, how do you think your school experience would have been different if someone had opened your eyes to all of this stuff back then?
It would have been massively different because it would have given me a framework, like an early on framework for understanding the world as it truly is, because I think not only does the canon that we're taught sort of erase us from it, but it also sort of erases like the history, like of like the colonial history of America, the colonial history of Britain, because it never faces, it never, poetry is supposed to be something that is true, supposed to be something that is honest, supposed to be something that can be political. But when you're given poets that I don't know, perhaps don't speak to that, or perhaps you're given a selection of writings that in some convenient way ignore the violent history that your country has sort of participated in, then you're almost historyless. You don't, and also you don't see yourself represented in the poetry, so you can't see it as a valid form of an outlet. So it would have changed a lot. However, I must say that it was also meaningful, and it was also soulful to go on this journey myself, and be able to discover this myself. I mean, it would have been so much easier if we would have been guided through that. But I mean, that's very much the system that we live in. We live in we live in an educational system of sweeping the truth under the brush and creating a conditioning. Especially when we're thinking about history and art, and how art informs history and vice versa.
I love what you say about how poetry can then be the medium for truth about that. I think that's really perfectly put. So we're going to hear your song Black Box. Can you tell us a little bit about this song before we hear it?
Yeah, sure. So this is a new song of mine that I sort of wrote during lockdown. And it's sort of, it starts with the premise of what would you tell if you survived it? And I don't know what it is, but what would you, what would be your story if you were to have survived, I don't know, the crash, for example? And I started to think of ourselves as tiny black boxes, or gigantic black boxes, and think about ourselves as how we collect everything. We collect our experiences, we collect our memories, and we sort of soak up our external environment. And yeah, I just sort of started to think of myself as this object that is constantly learning from what is happening to me, and then the objects, and then thinking of myself as the object that survived whatever had happened. So yeah, that's sort of the premise of this song, and yeah, it's called Black Box.
Yeah, I'm the black box, I survived it all. Always chasing the night before with a knife and fork. Cradle this baby's body, gotta get back to sleep. This life's a bore, and when the morning calls it's time to brawl. Scoffing the beta blockers, it's all too much, back to the sweetest nothing. Queasy often, always seeking sleazy offerings. The measly crumbs pour through the table in abundance. Keep me gobbling on the bottle of mediocrity, searing hot. My demons dog me to try and steer me off. Drag these legs through the sleet and fog, but I skewed the plot and forgot what I'm dreaming of. I saw the helicopter, I wrote the melodrama, I read the teleprompter, sometimes it's God I ponder. My mummy cooked the okra, thinking of ancestors we lost in translation or painstakingly forsaken. Best to forget I sip the echinacea, more like second nature, everything I say is heavily premeditated. I play the chime with my innards. I'm in a punk band screaming everything is photo worthy. What drives my obsession? You were the life of the party. I'd hibernate till you'd finish. The past is a prison, and going back is wise or it isn't. It's all the same though. Feeling like I'll die from the distance and trying to pay a bill from arts like hunting light in abyss. Behind the latch there's just void and rats. The roofs collapsed. We left that honeymoon glow back at your student flat where we schmoozed and laughed. I'm stooped over, bruised and taxed, swallowing seismic waves, chewing over, chewing the facts. It's all a drag, I'm falling back off kilter, vision still sinking slow. Gone are the days where I'm writing rhymes, now I'm building bows. Carve my footnotes in quill and coal. Never learned to dance myself, I just hid my hell inside a winter coat. Hold me close, let me comatose tenfold. I need everything to know me like some benzos, a wedding ring. Find me anything to kill some time, a soliloquy, a lullaby. We were so close. We were so close, yeah. What survives us feeling peace of mind? Another year trying to pass me by. We got so close, we got so close, yeah. Back when everything was off the sun, and I'd never even shot my gun. We were so close, we got so close, da-da-da-da-da. Fill my body up with empty pride, though I never found a finish line. I was so close, I got so close, yeah, yeah.
Something that I wanted to ask you about is how people tend to receive your work. Like, do people find they'll hear your music and then they didn't think that they would be into poetry before, very sort of anti it, and then they hear your music and they're like, oh, kind of change their opinion?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that happened a lot maybe when I was poet laureate. I think people have a certain conditioning of what a poet should look like, the books a poet should have read. I often got, "Oh, you're so well read,"
Yeah.
So there's that sort of like those little microaggressions that sort of like trying to erase the fact that you could be a valid poet. But I think for the most part, when people sort of like heard my poetry and sort of engaged with my poetry, um, it sort of left me with a space to break some form of conditioning around what they thought poetry could be, or
Yeah.
who they thought valid poetic influences were. Because I would openly say, where they were expecting me to say my influence was William Wordsworth, I would tell them that it was Blackfoot from The Roots, or Open Mike Eagle, or someone like that. So yeah, I think it was a beautiful thing to sort of have that opportunity to be poet laureate and sort of smash some sort of stuffy stereotype of what poetry is, an elitist idea of what poetry is. And yeah, it was always fun to see the looks on people's faces. It
I
was
can
always
imagine.
ironic, and yeah, it was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, so Sheffield Poet Laureate, what was that like? What did you do in that role?
hmm It was such a like varied experience. Really, it was an honor to sort of like take on the role. I got asked to take on the role in 2018, and because there hasn't been a poet laureate before. It was really it was really much a journey of discovery of what the
Yeah.
role could be. And I did a lot of work with young people, talking about poetry, talking about hip hop, delivering workshops. I delivered my first public lecture at the University of Sheffield around hip hop and poetry, um, and I guess the political power of vulnerability and things like that. And I got to travel, I got to perform. So it was very. It's like it was a new experience. It was sort of uncharted territory, but yeah, it was a beautiful thing.
Was that something that you ever expected you would be doing, like giving these sorts of lectures and stuff?
Uh, Yes and no. No, I didn't expect it to come in the shape and form that it came in. But yes, because I don't know, there is a certain level of ego that a hip hop artist assumes in their own writing, or sort of like believes in their own writing. And I definitely I definitely had a sort of self assurance, or a blind self belief in my own work and its impact, even to my own detriment sometimes. So. It was quite self-affirming. It was quite reaffirming.
Yeah.
So yeah, but yeah, I didn't expect it to come in the shape and form that it came in. Really.
You have to have that confidence, I think, in your work as a creative. If you want to go somewhere, you
Mhm.
have to. I mean, humility it can be a really nice quality, but sometimes you really got to be. I back myself. I believe in this work and believe I can do good things. And
Sure. I mean,
yeah,
especially in this industry, where the creative industry, where it's so oversaturated, it is sadly falling victim to this capitalist idea that there's only one spot. It can get very mentally wearying, and I think you do have to have sort of like, uh, I was raised in a household of faith, if you will. So humility is something that I very much value. However, I think when it comes to your own artistic career, or your own artistic practice, you have to have somewhat of a strong foundation of self belief, and confidence in your
yeah,
own work, because nobody else will. Because trends change so quickly, and what is respected shifts constantly. So if you're not speaking to whatever is popular at the time, or if you're not speaking to a certain idea that is being commended, then sometimes you just won't be congratulated for the work you're doing. So it's that self-belief that's gonna inform your consistency, and your
Yeah,
longevity, Yeah.
definitely. Okay, I think it would be nice to hear one of your poems. I think the first one we've got planned is Celebratory Water.
Yeah, sure. It is not a word. No, no, it is not an amalgamation of uttered tones. It is not changeable under the bridge of a tongue, under the shifting dialect of a people's. It is not a thing one just names, like a gun, but a body full of bullets. A story that cannot explain itself in literation but is understood unspeakably. In the absence of alliterated iteration and obliterated sense, of reason it has no sense, no reason, not a summer sky to be gazed into, but a becoming without being named by exploiting eyes. Not a sound, no, no, nor the whistle of a bird, but the word is that which makes wings. Wings like celebratory water, the bad side of good, where I've lived out my whole life. That one time there was no dessert, my father apologized with a jar of jam. What a privilege it is to die fed and clothed like a glass bottle of air. I fill myself with everything in front and behind of me, spiritless but performing some kind of full. I find myself no longer afraid of the terror-soaked dreams. Whatever has followed me for decades has surely become a part of me now. The same air we breathe becomes the same thoughts we think. I no longer frisk the light switches, nor commentate on the saturated colour. These quarters, these lines, once motes engulfing my swimming soul, where I skinny dip in this rotting levee, rotting with a levee on my head like dead memes. No longer piecing myself together for a timely fashion, a sea of sectors, spectating because it is already done. My best poems I never wrote. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Otis. That was amazing.
Thank you.
I mean, this poem is sort of, there's living life on the edge. I mean, those lines, the bad side of good, where I've lived my whole life, but there's also um, so much power and hope as well. When I mean
Yeah.
that the one section that really stands out to me was what a privilege it is to die fed and clothed like a glass bottle of
Mm,
air. I think that's just
mm.
an amazing sort of comparison between those two ideas. What sparked this
Oh, thank
poem
you so
into
much.
existence?
Oh, that's such a good question. It's so hard to answer. I think I'm working on a new book of mine, and the book is called Drawn and Quartered, and I was thinking about different ways in which our identities have been quartered off or fractioned off into different sections, both in our society or both what happens to us internally and what we do to ourselves, what we subject ourselves to. And like thinking about that sort of encompassed, sort of cradled with it, the ideas about childhood, ideas about school and schooling, and sort of I guess just putting different experiences like that would both be represented as good and bad and difficult and turbulent together and letting them live together in sort of harmony. And I think that's where this poem came about, and it came about with this premise of sort of like this imagery of celebratory water, like celebrating something that is so necessary for our survival. So I think in the poem is naturally this quality of gratitude, even in the face of a forever, a lifelong lack, or a lifelong wanting or yearning, or a lifelong sort of like emptiness. This idea that we're constantly thirsty, we constantly need to be, our thirst constantly needs to be quenched, and that will never go, that will never leave us, that sort of hole will never stop. And being grateful for when it can be sort of quenched, and when we can sort of fulfill ourselves and fulfill our needs and our passions and our hopes and our dreams. So that was kind of the premise of the poem.
I mean, it's really amazing to hear hear that backstory behind it and have such generous insight into that. And something that I sort of thought about when I was listening to you read it is that I wondered how it feels when you read your work. I don't know if unaccompanied is the right word, but without the music, because your poems have like a super musical quality to them, even
Oh,
when they
amazing.
haven't got music with them. So how does that feel for you when you read them?
Yeah, that's interesting. I sort of the musicality isn't always intentional, but I think is inseparable for sort of from my writing. I think it's sort of injected in everything that I write, just because my first understanding of poetry was a musical one.
Yeah.
You know, my first understanding of poetry was rhythmic. It was through hip hop, and then sort of my study sort of led me into trying to think about jazz and how jazz can be the forefather and foremother of hip hop, and thinking about how, well, jazz not only has mastered so many musical forms in and of itself, but is also a foundation and is also breaking form. Whenever I'm writing a poem, I'm thinking about, perhaps subconsciously, not consciously, I'm thinking about um, how can this poem, how can this piece sort of take what I've learned from hip hop, take what I've learned from poetry, but also break it and sort of, inject a bit of anarchism in it and see how we can break what is expected of me rhythmically and structurally. And I also don't quite understand poetic structure in a literary sense myself, which I think sometimes is informing my work in a positive light, because it means that I'm not bound by any sort of mode, or any literary mode or convention. It means that I can just sort of let it flow freely, which is, I think, why perhaps it reads as this formless piece, is also because I don't understand how to sort of fit in the box of traditional form. So yeah, I think that's kind of why,
Yeah. I wonder if that also holds some people back, like if they think they have to write in this very traditional form. And I can
Yeah.
imagine hearing your stuff can sort of get a lot of like thoughts going in people's heads thinking, oh, I actually don't there's nothing that I have to
Uh-huh.
do, that poetry can just be about your experience of it and how you want to do it.
Yeah,
So
so true. I mean, I think about that whenever I'm delivering workshops or anything. I'm constantly thinking about how can I set an example for how form can be broken, and how whatever we learn in school about what poetry is, or whatever we learn from, I don't know, like generational understanding of poetry, doesn't always have to be the representation of what your poetry can be. Like it doesn't. You don't have to sort of replicate that in any way. And also, I'm uber dyslexic, which I think, interestingly enough, like informs my work, because it makes me look at language as not only having sort of like a logical function, not always having a theoretical function, but sometimes having a metaphysical, metaphorical function. Sometimes a word doesn't always hold um, as much weight in terms of its functional meaning for me as it does for perhaps somebody else. So I'm able to perhaps open up a word and allow it, try and bend it, and try and use it in words in ways that aren't always conventionally used. That might be frowned upon outside of our creative realm, but somehow works within our creative realm, because it's all about. I think about like Wittgenstein. It's all about creating our own language game. And that's kind of how I Um, see my artistic practices, creating my own language game, instead of trying to fit into somebody else's game, and instead of trying to understand the conventions of somebody else's game, or perhaps a game that has been set by my predecessors. What does it mean to create your own, and think about inviting people into that? And I think that's where perhaps that's why we enjoy our favorite poets, is because they've not followed conventional structure. They've broke it, and we've been invited into their world, as expansive as it is. So yeah, that's often how I'm thinking about it.
I love that. Okay, how about we hear your next poem?
Yeah, sure. So this next poem is called BED, and is also taken from a new poetry collection that is not yet out, called Drawn and Quartered. Shrill and shriek curdle from twisted sheets, a rickety rudiment of planks. The paradiddle slat out of pocket, Rusty piano keys beating tiny hammers on the back. Agony and electricity stroking the spine. Carpentering words out of thunder. Breaking the morning skies again. I can't feel my legs. Fidget for a few. You know the drill, curl the toes running suicides laid still. Crack each kneecap like the cocking back of a Winchester shotgun. Contort the ankle. Stretch the calf out like pizza dough. Flux the body's contour into a hot metallic soup. And drown the mainframe that coded last night's binge. The bottom of this bed is thirsty. Etch a note into the floorboard, staccato down the stairs. Relish the tone of each step, but sever yourself from where you came. Get through brekkie. Scour the backs of cereal boxes for poisonous philosophy and corn syrup. Battering ram the urge. Swallow the truncheon sigh. A banana will do. Out the door triumphant, a meal truant. Drawn and quartered. Head hanging like autumn droop. Crushing berries beneath mallet feet. Foragers gasping by the stomp with no pick-me-up to spare. Just homebrew toilet wine for foreign citizens. Or red ink exile by the footprint. Stick legs smothered in yellow sheen. Face heavy with a jaundiced glow. Wobbly knee the side catwalking platoons flaunting a comfy lineage. Catcalling with bloated tails. Veins bulging by the bark. But mine, a limp whimper. And then you crave the bed. A thick musk nests the scalp and ushers those fine ringlets into retirement. Jet and gothic. Pride in every pick, tangled and estranged, a burning bush now. Humming to me in roots. Clumps of coal-tinged smoke dizzying a pale god, dogly pats of the soft swamp made messy. Nutty and setting fire to shop fronts. Inconveniencing those tired eyes of National Front in uniform sentry, coarse and toppling effigies of their bloodlust, chewing rind as they nail me to a tree like Christ or a missing persons poster. Assurance and creme de praline. Still biting. The bed. You make confidence out of intuition, I ostrich head the fondant icing, gorging its innards, a bunker under the burning wick, escaping sweet time. Teeth dusted with mosaic gold. Smile bursting my cheeks, calamitous jazz at every jaw jitter. Eyes like two M dashes. A reoccurring dream is nightmarish, pressed inside the story. Like a flower head, smushed between Bible pages. Bedlam and bed solace. Thank you.
Thank you, Otis. I mean, that was such an amazingly vivid poem, and so it was so detailed. I loved listening to you read it, so thank you. I mean, so we've heard like a couple of your poems now. I mean, actually, before I ask this question, so what was going through your head when you wrote this poem? Just let's hear a little bit more about the background of this one.
Yeah, for sure. This one's very vivid to me because I think that I feel like sometimes there's two types of like creative processes. There's the one that is sort of like where you're sitting by your desk and you're like, I would love to write something now, you know? I would love to work on a poem. And that maybe takes a little more patience. It takes a little more sort of like acquiring some sort of internal like history of practice, like internal, like pulling from like a pool of previous inspiration, of previous times that you wrote pieces, and just being patient and sitting and waiting for it to manifest on the page. And then there's the second kind of poem or creative practice for me where it's very much like, I need to write this poem, like this has to sort of come out right now, and it's sort of for a lack of a better term, sort of being vomited or being bled out onto the page with little control, you know. And this was very much one of those poems. And again, I was sitting down thinking about my book and thinking about the themes around that. But this piece is very much about it's very much about eating disorders and I guess my journey with struggling with BED, which is binge eating disorder. And I think encompassed in that is very much this idea, again, thinking back to being drawn and quartered, or being sort of like sectioned off into different identities, and thinking about how that happened in the space and time that is school, and in the space and time that is teenagehood and childhood, and the process between those two states. So yeah, it's a little bit about identity, racial identity. There's a little bit about I guess masculinity in there, or a lack thereof, and then that is all encompassed by this reoccurring mantra of the bed being thirsty, or of you craving the bed, and the bed being this place of comfort, this safe space. But for me, the bed being something that stood for binge eating disorder, BED, thinking of food and how the body feels when you've encompassed your sort of pain or your trauma in a sort of like in a sort of like a quilt or a blanket of food sort of thing, and you've created this comfort mechanism, or this sort of defense mechanism. So yeah, the poem goes through that sort of process.
And you seem to weave all of your ideas and themes together really intricately. I mean, listening to you explain it then, I was just absolutely fascinated by how you brought it all together, and how this poem kind of touches on all of those main parts of Drawn and Quartered by the sounds of it.
Yeah,
And I don't know if this is a coincidence, but I do find it interesting the mention here, like as you talked of the bed being this place of comfort, and I don't know if that's intentional, how it links to the next poem that we're going to hear from you, which is Insert Sleep Here. But maybe that is a coincidence. If it is, then tell me, and I'll back off. But this idea of sleep that seems to and dreaming and nightmares, that sort of seems to recur throughout your writing as well.
Yeah, definitely not a coincidence. This is sort of like the order that I would perform them in a sort of live performance setting. It's definitely something that I think about and consider, and it's because sleep and dreaming, and I guess the bed, is somehow very present in my work. It, like, reoccurs throughout my work, not always intentionally, but I guess I've got a somewhat of an artistic fixation on some of these themes, you know.
Yeah. Okay.
And
Well,
then I think often I'm writing out of a feeling of trying to grasp whatever that dream state is, you know. And often my work is coming about at night time, and sort of I stay up late, and that's when artistic ideas come to me. So it feels like this very sort of ephemeral, surreal state, that can only be attributed to, like, sleep or dreaming, you know.
that really makes sense to me, actually, because I noticed throughout your writing that you inhabit a lot of liminal spaces, and in the poem
Uh-huh.
that we will hear from you in a minute, there's one line that goes, the space in between everything before and after, and things like that crop up
Yeah.
quite a lot. These sorts of in and out spaces, before and after spaces. So, and that is very
Yeah, for
dreamlike.
sure.
That's very sleep like. So should we hear your next poem?
I know you're tired. I've drank the dry sip that never meets satisfaction. During glimpses, I've felt decades of drought. I know all about the boulders that rest in wrinkles, forcing crooked smiles. I know the massive moons in orbit rest on your weary back. I know how weight feels. I know the cliche that pressure makes for precious stones, but sometimes we just break. We break before we meet esteem. And stillbirths still happen to those born and grown. I'm standing on the back of an insect, and in all my power, I felt all my insignificance, how life could just be stomped out. And I remember the feeling, like cities raining down on my body, drops of water concentrated with people, time, buildings, iron curtains, metal debris, all the world's ills and its machinery toppling down on my bare back. I know drowning makes it hard to stay awake. I thought about how to think when your head's trapped inside the tank of running water, but your body roams free. I remember gulping and gasping for help, but nobody could break me out of myself. I was an insect too. I know how to forget to sleep, and when I keep my eyes open long enough, I see technicolor that isn't there. I stood on the neck of an arachnid. I felt what it feels to have no bones, no structure, just the space in between everything before and after. I know you're tired. I remember the feeling of helpless days. I remember that sacrifice isn't always compromise. Thank you.
Thank you, Otis. That was so powerful. So, how did this poem come about for you? Where did it begin?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. This poem is perhaps an older one. It's from my first poetry collection called Safe Metamorphosis, and it came about sort of like in the dead of night, as sort of like all my poems do. Again, thinking about this strange space between um, your body and your mind getting prepared to dream, getting prepared to sleep, but not quite being there yet. I feel like it sort of
Oh no.
opens yourself up for like different imagery, for different worlds of thought, because your body and your mind is ready for a world that doesn't actually exist, or is ready for a world that exists in a different form or state, should I say, in a different plane of existence. So that's the state in which the poem came about. But I think the poem was very much about, I guess, the suffering of the people closest to me, and that suffering being at the hand of sort of a capitalistic rat race or chase, and thinking about the exhaustion that people carry, especially the people around me that carry with them. This constant battle to be good enough, or to meet some sort of standard, this constant battle to need to earn money in order to function, in order to exist and sort of live and survive. So I very much saw this poem as an archiving of what it means to live under late stage capitalism, and sort of try and survive, and
Yeah.
how tired it can be.
Yeah. I mean, the rat race is the perfect term for that. It's just constant.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. I think, well, so we're coming up to the end of this Meet the Poet, and we have one more poem left from you. But before we hear that, I just wanted, could you tell us about any of your upcoming? I mean, you've got the book that you're working on, any other projects or gigs or anything of the like that you might want to share with the audience before we finish off for this episode?
Yeah, for sure. So thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you sort of taking the time. It's been super fun to sort of delve in these ideas, and thank you for listening to my poetry for the last hour. So yeah, I'm working on a series of new pieces. I am currently working at releasing a new EP called "Things I Should Have Said a Year Ago," which was what the song Black Box is taken from. So that may probably be out whilst you're listening to this podcast, to this interview. And it's very much a sort of 7-song self-produced sort of exploration of loss and grief, but also the feeling of being weathered by time and what it means to survive that and exist through that. And yeah, that'll be out on all sorts of streaming platforms. It'll be out on Bandcamp. It's called Things I Should Have Said a Year Ago. And that'll be followed by a new poetry collection in 2023, hopefully early 2023, called Drawn and Quartered, which you've heard some of the poems from today. I've got some shows coming up in May. On May 7th, I've got a show in Sheffield. On May 4th, I've got a show in London at the Servant Jazz Quarters. So for any Southern London people, feel free to come down to that show. So I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be launch of and in celebration of this new EP that I mentioned. And yes, it's going to be fun.
Fantastic. Okay, well, I'll hand over to you for your final poem.
So this poem is again from my book Safe Metamorphosis, and is very much a foundational poem for my work and my artistic influence. And it is what it says on the tin, if you will. It's called An Ode to Black Thought, and is an ode to my favorite MC and poet, Black Thought of the Roots, who we spoke about earlier. But also just an ode and a moment of appreciation to hip hop culture and the beautiful art, the beautiful Black art of hip hop and jazz, and everything that it means to me and how it shaped me. And again, this poem was a stencil from an actual dream that I had. I just wrote exactly what I saw in the dream. I had a dream I went to see the Roots. The atmosphere was electric. Questlove played an eternal break of undoubted flavour to call out Black Thought, who rushed the stage like a floating spirit, both hurrying and taking time in one. Tariq was draped down in a black silk cloak that covered the whole stage. The cape of sorts was embroidered with red lines that ran parallel throughout the cloth, like the blood vessels of midnight streets in Philadelphia. And his cadence embodied revolution. Like the dreams of my youth, where in sleep I sought out validation from favored artists, I woke myself up with a croaked inner voice proclaiming, I need that. I was speaking of the cape. If only I could wear its skin like my own and feel what it feels to be the sound of reverence and just rest and rest in it. I had a dream I went to see the Roots. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Otis. You have been an absolutely brilliant guest, and that was a beautiful poem to end on. So thank you so much for chatting with me about your work. To everyone who's watching this at home, you can find out more about Otis and all that he's working on via the links in the description. Do drop us a comment, let Otis know what you thought of it all, and subscribe to our channels if you enjoyed it. Follow us on socials and sign up to our mailing list to be notified about all things like this. Huge thank you again to you, Otis, for being just a magnificent Meet the Poet guest. It's been great having you on here.
Likewise, thanks so much.
Poetry. She moves like ivy, every word re-encoding itself even after the hostile earth, dry as paper, becomes uncontrollable ivy.